Okay. So what is displayed by each line in the following code snippets? So the first line here, we're dividing an integer by an integer. So we talked about this last week, and anytime you're doing arithmetic and you have two integers involved, then the result is going to also be an integer, which means that this value here will be 7 divided by 3 without any decimal places after it as the result. So this will be equal to 2. In this case here, we're dividing one floating point number by one integer. Now, when you have this kind of situation, you have a mix of a floating point number here as well as an integer here. The result in this case is going to also be a floating point number, because C++ is going to see this and say, hey, well, you are doing some floating point arithmetic. Now that means that the rest of this expression should also be evaluated as if every number is going to be floating point, so that we can give you a floating point answer. And that also fits with this case here. So in this case, 7 divided by 3 gives you an integer, but these remaining two will give you floating point results. I'm going to start up a new project here just so that I can go over the homework. You guys don't have to follow along just yet. Okay, so if you were to just print out what the result of those are, seven by 3 is, and it was totally okay for you to verify the result by writing the code, but I kind of wanted you to just write the answer in the comments here. So 7 divided by 3 is going to be equal to an integer value, while 7.0 divided by 3 is going to be equal to a floating point number. And likewise, if all the numbers are floating point, then the result is also going to be floating point. Like so. Okay. So as you can see, the answers here, 7 divided by 3 is 2, 7.0 divided by 3, and 7.0 divided by 3.0 both give the same result. Okay. This is going to be really important when you have to understand what types of numbers you're dealing with, because sometimes these won't be numbers that you typed in directly. Sometimes they'll be variables that store numbers. And if you have two variables that are also integers, the result is going to be an integer. So as I mentioned before, things like health percentage, if you have some like health that you have versus max health, and you divide one by the other, and they're both integers, the result is going to be an integer. Which means if I have something like, oh, I have 560 health out of 1,000, what is my percentage of health remaining here? If this was my RPG that I'm making, and I'm printing out I'm doing a little progress bar, the result of this is going to be 0. Okay? It's a really common mistake to make. So anytime you're doing two integers divided by one another, you're going to get an integer result. Any questions on that?
Does that go for like any type of damage, like certain bullet ranges?
Yeah, sure. Like let's say you have ammo count remaining. What percentage of ammo is left in your magazine in a game? You have like 23 bullets out of a 40-round clip. This will also be 0. So when you're printing out something like let's do install percentage, right? Like you guys know how like you see progress bars in games that tell you how close you are to maybe loading the next level, right? And oftentimes that is represented as in this level I have 1,230 objects to load. I've loaded 570 of them so far. So when you want to give load percent, you do this math, and this is going to be your percentage remaining. So typically you represent that as 100 times that, because 570. So I just do this in calculator, divided by 1230. That's 40.46. I multiply this by 100 to get 46% loaded on my next level. However, if you do your arithmetic like this, you're always going to get 0, because this is going to give you back a 0 result. Oh, I do this first. this is going to give you 0 as a result first. Okay? That's why you have to be careful when you're trying to do arithmetic. You have to make sure that if any of these numbers are integers, the way that you work around is by you make one of these things a floating point number like that. That'll give you back a floating point result as well. So you can see here now it says 46%. All right. Next question is, write a program that gets 3 game scores and displays the average. So I just asked you to print out 3 game scores. So these are 3 scores for any game that you want. So I'm going to do something like enter the first score for Overwatch PC. And then you could just have 3 variables to store the scores. So I'm going to declare all 3. I'm going to call one score 1. And have another one for score 2 and another one for score 3. That's going to be the first score here. I'm going to repeat this whole thing 2 more times. Once, twice. And you're going to, each time you ask for a score, you're going to put it into a different variable here. Okay? Like so. And then when you want to print out the average, what is the average of 3 scores? Divide by 3, right? Is, and I can do this on the same line here. I can make an expression right here. Now, whenever you're doing arithmetic, remember that it follows the operator precedence. So if I'm adding things and I want to divide it by 3, I have to wrap them in parentheses first. Otherwise, if I didn't have parentheses, what is this expression actually going to do?
It's going to divide the score 3 by 3,
yes,
and add 1 and 2 to the rest.
That's right. And this is going to give me a really weird result. Also, what we just talked about was that when you're doing arithmetic with numbers, these 3 numbers are integers, right?
Yes.
So what happens if I divide it also by another integer here? I'm going to get back an integer result, right?
Yes.
So I'm not going to be able to get a floating point result. So let's make sure that, I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to enter like, I don't know, 99, 450, IGN, thank you. So is that actually correct? Let's see if that actually adds up here. 99 plus 50 plus 78. So the actual score is 75.66. I want that extra 2/3. So how do we get this extra decimal point? It's cutting off the decimal places because
just make the 3 a float.
Make this thing a 3.0, like that. What did I say, 78? 78. So now you see I have a decimal places here. So when you're doing your average, make sure that when you divide it by 3, that you're dividing by 3.0, okay? Now, you might be asking also, why don't I just use 3.0? Why don't I just use floating point numbers every time just to save it? Well, there are a few cases where you actually don't want floating points, where you actually want it to cut off the remainder of it, especially for things like let's say the average kills that you have in a game of Overwatch, right? In some cases, up to the designer might want to show that the average number of kills that you get is like, I don't know, 30.6, right? You get 30 and then like almost 2/3 of a kill. In other cases, it might make more sense to just show you, hey, you just get about 30 kills per game. And depending on what you divide it by, you'll get a different result for your statistic that you want to show. And it kind of like comes up to player choice or like what you kind of want to present to the player. So keep that in mind when you're doing this work. So notice here when I'm printing out, I just divide these. I add these all together first with parentheses, and then I divide by the number of scores that I have. Okay. Any questions on that one? Yeah.
When you're typing, if you put 3.0f earlier,
Mm-hmm.
is that what is?
So yes. So when it comes to floating point numbers, last week we talked about these doubles, right? So we're going to call this like, I'm just going to call this. So a double takes up a certain amount of memory, and a float is exactly the same as a double. However, it takes half as much memory. That's all it means. A float is a floating point number. A double literally means double the size of a floating point. So this is going to be These two both represent floating point numbers. However, this guy here takes up 4 bytes of memory, and this guy here takes up 8 bytes of memory. And remember when I talked about memory, about how the cost is last week, and how you want to try to use the one that is less? So when you go down here and you specify this decimal point, if you put an F on here that says use this as a floating point number, or use this as a float instead of a double. And for the most part, it doesn't really matter. However, in some cases, if these were doubles here, these 3 variables were doubles, it would give me a warning saying, hey, I'm dividing these doubles by something a little bit smaller than double, a float. It doesn't really matter in this case because it'll automatically convert these over to whatever this thing is here. So it converted all 3 of these, the result of this 3 additions, into a floating point number because this was a floating point. So you get your choice. There are also there's also other ways you can do prefixing, which I'll show later. It gets a little weird because in some cases you can do like this. You can put like the letter L in front of things. And this is all very specific stuff. But keep in mind that for the most part, when you're typing in numbers, it doesn't really matter if you do 3 or F. All right. That's a good question. Any other questions? OK. Now I want to just convert a distance that's in furlongs and convert it into yards. So it's a similar idea where I'm going to store a distance in furlongs. And I'm going to ask for that distance. And I'm going to input it into that variable that I just created, like so. And I want to print out what the distance is in yards. So you have a couple of ways that you can do this. One, you can just print out the result in the next line. So if I wanted to, I could print out the distance in yards is the distance in furlongs times 220. Notice here I'm not using a floating point number at all. And that's OK, because I'm doing multiplication here. And this number here is going to be an integer. So the way I set up this, let me zoom out a little bit, is I print out the result in an expression inside my statement for printing to the screen. So I print out the string, and then I separate it with this separator, and then I print out what I want to show on the screen, which is going to be the value that you entered times 220. Okay? So now I'm going to go through and enter my scores again. I'm just going to ignore what these are. And now I'm going to enter distance in furlongs. So I'm going to enter something simple like 10. And I see that my distance in yards is 2,200. And this is perfectly OK. However, if I wanted to actually use that distance in yards, like let's say I want to use it in another statement or an expression down here, I would have to do this operation again. So another way that you can solve this is you can make a variable that's distance in yards. And remember that you can assign a value to a variable by doing equals the value here. Also, you don't have to do it on the same line. You could set this equal to 0 first, and then on the next line, you can do your operation here too. And then all you have to do is change, oops, this is going to be distance in yards. And then all you have to do is print out this right here. And the way I prefer this way because I like having a separate variable just because oftentimes when you're making expressions like this, you're using the result in more than one place, which means if you store the value in another variable, now you can just kind of sprinkle this as many times as you want to. You don't have to do this operation every time. For instance, if I wanted to, if I undid all this and didn't have a variable, and now let's say I want to print out the square. You guys know a square is just a number multiplied by itself. Mm-hmm. So I take this. How do I square this number? Just multiply it by itself, right? Yeah. So I'd have to do this. Okay. What about the cube of a number? It's a number multiplied by itself 3 times. So I take this whole thing. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So you can do you do this once, twice, 3 times here. Now this can be simplified if you actually had a variable. Like so. And now when you want to do this math, you just do this replacement like this. And just multiply it by that. You save yourself some typing, and you also save yourself some time if you accidentally got the formula wrong. Okay? All right, any questions? So you could solve it any way. You don't have to. You didn't have to have made a variable to store it, but I prefer making variables to store the results of expressions. Okay, Celsius and equivalent Fahrenheit. This is very similar to the Furlong problem. However, we're dealing with floating point numbers now. So in this case, we have a value here that's a floating point number. So I'm going to take, what did we ask for? Celsius, degrees in Celsius. I'm going to ask for, what is it? Please enter a Celsius. Okay. And then we can print out what the result is in Fahrenheit. Again, I could do this one of 2 ways. I could either just print out the result right here. It says 20 degrees Celsius is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So how do we combine these strings? We say print out the degrees in Celsius first. And then you say degrees Celsius is. And then we do our result here. And Celsius is 1.8. What is it? Times degrees Celsius. Plus 32. Spell that right. Fahrenheit. This is a long expression here. Zoom out all the way. See the statement here? It does multiple things. It first prints out the degrees in Celsius, then I put a space, and then the name of Celsius, the string here. Then I do the expression for the formula to convert it to Fahrenheit, and then I print out the word Fahrenheit afterwards. Okay. So let's run this program. Let's go through our Overwatch scores again. Furlongs. And then we do our distance Fahrenheit. Celsius is 20 degrees. So there's our answer right there. Okay. This is more just another version of like the Furlong program. Again, you can make a variable to store this if you wanted to. If you want to store the result in here, you could. All you have to do is this. Like so. Okay. Any questions on that one? All right, let's do the last one here. So enter hour and minute, and display the 2 values shown like this. Okay, you got to combine those 2 numbers here. And it's actually kind of similar to how we did the degrees in Celsius and Fahrenheit. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to ask for time in hours and minutes. So I'm going to store those 2 variables. Hours. I'm just going to call this one hours, and I'll call this one minutes. Okay. And I'm going to ask for both. Okay, and then I'm also going to do the minutes, like so. And then we're just going to combine these 2 into the time. And by combining them, I just separate each one that I want to print. So in this case, I'm going to print hours first. And then I'm going to print minutes next. So hours, separated, colon, separate it, and then put minutes. Notice here that I'm not putting my variables inside quotes, okay? Anything that you want to type as a string, as literal text, you put inside quotes. In this case, the only thing I want as text is going to be this time and the colon here. Okay, and the hours is going to be 9, 28 minutes. So it just takes these two and puts them in the same string. Okay. All right, questions on this? This is going to be number 5. Yeah.
I notice you're not putting the end L after every.
Oh, after here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
You don't have to do that?
yeah, so watch what happens when I do that. So I didn't do that for the scores. Notice where my cursor is when I'm asking for scores right here. If I didn't do that, the numbers that I typed in here would actually go on the next line. So you could do that. It's kind of a personal preference thing. So watch where the cursor is now, down here. So you have your choice of where you want to do that. If you skip the E and the L right here, you can just put it right at the end of the line. This is number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. Okay, so I'm going to collect the homework, and then I'll put this up on Zool so you guys can grab it.